Hey, we're really glad that you can join us here for our online church. We put this together so that you could use it for your small groups. And we try to do this as a preview of the coming sermon that is going to be broadcast and live and also in person on Sunday. So this is for January 24th. We're in the sermon series, The Return, and in this we're looking at a number of things about this time that we find ourselves away, we find ourselves in the wilderness, we find ourselves sojourning, and in the return, we're discovering that you can always return. During this series, not only are we going to be looking at ways of returning, but also why God puts us into these kinds of situations and how we handle them. And today we're going to look at a very important biblical theme that we see not only in the Bible, but throughout human history, and that's the idea of an exile. To be exiled is to be in a state of being barred from one's native country. You may have remembered people like Napoleon were exiled. And in the Bible, what it talks about is that all people, in a sense, who are created by God are in exile. So last week we talked about Adam and Eve and original sin. And remember, they were exiled from Eden. And the scriptures talk about the fact that we find ourselves not only away from Eden, but also our heavenly home. And this is what it says in Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so when we're in exile, which we all are because we're separated from God, we're looking forward to that city that God has built. So in that sense, we're going to look at a very important exile in the Bible. And this, again, we're going to go throughout the scriptures. We're going to be looking at Jacob. Jacob spent 20 years in exile, leaving his homeland because of a number of circumstances. And in those 20 years, he learned a number of things. And we're going to learn a couple things today. The 2 points that we're going to talk about is that in exile, God blesses us with his presence. And second, in exile, God blesses us with our true identity. So first of all, in exile, God blesses us with his presence. Genesis 28 is sort of the first part of Jacob's moving into exile. He had dreamed, Genesis 28:12 says, and he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So he finds himself in this place because he had, first of all, tricked his brother Esau out of his birthright, and then he had stolen a blessing that his father Isaac was supposed to give to Esau, but he had pretended he was Esau, and he had stolen that blessing. And Esau was so mad that he wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob left that land and he journeyed to his uncle and he went to a far country. And so as he was going on his way, he had this dream. And so as Jacob goes into exile, God meets with Jacob through this ladder. Verse 13 goes on, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And as Jacob goes into exile, God makes this promise to Jacob. He goes on to say in verse 15, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So when Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. What's important about this is that throughout Jacob's life, he'd been manipulating circumstances in order to have things go his way. And he found himself in a place where no amount of manipulation could get him out of the fact that he had to leave his homeland. So partly, it was his own doing, in major part, but there's another thing behind this, and that is God's actions. And so as he goes into exile, he learns that wherever he goes, God is there. You know, that old joke, wherever you go, there you are. One of the things that we can say is, wherever you go, there is God. And so even after the exile of this relational sin, because he sins against Esau in an incredible way, God is still there with him. Now, we need to not be confused, because it doesn't mean that because God is with you, that God is against everybody else. God is able to be with every single person. And so as we go into exile, one of the things that we find is that we're stripped of all the things that we depended on. Our home, our family, our friends, perhaps our job. And we're only left with a knowledge that God is there. And so God blesses Jacob by having him have this dream in which a ladder descends from heaven. And the ladder symbolizes that God is present with him, connecting from heaven to earth. And I think when we find ourselves in exile, whether it's a small e exile, which would be something like moving from job to job, sometimes it just feels weird. Even though you know you're moving from that job, you made that decision, there's this feeling of loss. Or perhaps seeing kids off to college, or an expected death, like somebody who you know is going to die, and then they die, maybe because they've died of an older age, or any kind of a change. You know, the smaller E would also be, as a child, you're sent to your room or you're grounded. And these exiles are small, but they have power. And then there's the exiles with a capital E, where you could be a feeling of being separated from God, like you've never come to God initially through Jesus Christ and believing on his death on the cross on your behalf. Or traumatic loss via some sort of traumatic or tragic death or other means, or job loss that you didn't want, or moving away from home against your wishes. These are all the kinds of things that we find ourselves in exile. And to be honest, during COVID, we are away from so many things that we are used to that the feeling of exile is very, very powerful. So here's a question for small groups. Share a time when you felt you were in a small e exile, or where you were in a capital E exile. Just share that with each other and just be open and honest. Now the second point that we want to make is that in exile, God blesses us with our true identity. After 20 years of being in exile, Jacob decided to return home, but he also knew that Esau was probably still quite mad. So he sent a messenger ahead of him, asking him to find favor. But the messenger says, Esau is coming with 400 men. And this just scares the bejesus out of Jacob. And so he calculates what is the best thing to do. And he's continuing to do that. He's still continuing to calculate and manipulate. So first he reminds God. Can you imagine this? He reminds God of God's promises, that God said to go back, and that God said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. The implication of reminding God of his promises is, what good are these promises going to do if Esau kills me? So he sends gifts of a huge amount of livestock, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels and their young 40 cows and 10 bulls and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. It's actually a little bit exhausting just to read this list. He sends these groups of livestock in 3 waves, telling his servants to remind everyone, your servant Jacob is coming right behind, and thinking that this would pacify Esau with these gifts. And then he sends all his wives, children, and servants to go ahead. And they're all gone, and he begins to just spend that time alone. And so Genesis 32 says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So this reminds us of Genesis 28, where God blesses him with his presence. And now Jacob in exile, not knowing what's going to happen, holds onto this person who he knows to be some representative of God, and just says, bless me. So the man asked him, what's your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And many translators think that Israel probably means struggles with God. So his name was this ongoing reminder of the fact that he had struggled with God and that God would bless him. And so God renames him. Genesis 32 then goes on. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But the man replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. It's really interesting that the person, he doesn't answer Jacob's question, which is very much like God's mysterious companionship. And it's in his companionship with us that we know and understand that God is with us, and we also find our identity. So when you go into exile, and you're trying to come back from exile, one of the things that you realize is that through death or loss of home or loss of family, if you hold on to God, then God gives you your identity. And for those of us who have trusted in Jesus Christ, our identity is in Christ. And if you're around a group of people, you want to just repeat that phrase, in Christ. It means that we are enfolded into the family of God, and that our identity, our true identity, is in Christ. And for some of us, we will never know or understand what our identity is until we go to a place of exile. Because it's in the place of exile that everything that we know or understand is stripped away from us, and we ultimately know and understand that our identity is in God. And this is a blessing, even though it feels like the opposite. Because once you know who you are able to trust in the Lord and trust in the Lord in all circumstances. So here's one last question for small groups. Sometimes we feel like we can be the cause of the exile. And in Jacob's case, this is literally true. But it is also true that God is involved. So thinking back on your times of exile, what did you think about yourself? Where did you go with your identity? And who did you become through that? So take some time to just talk that over. Well, we hope that this has been a great time for you as you've been thinking together as a small group. And as we continue in this time together, through this COVID time, through it and beyond it, we need to continue to ask ourselves, where are we now in our life? And how has this tumultuous time affected our relationship with God? And where does God want us to go? May the Lord bless you today.